Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here, and we're so glad that so many of you have expressed how grateful you are for the presence of Ambassador Ross tonight. And so I'll be very quick with a bio. You're here because you know that this is the preeminent expert in this region, in these issues of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel and the Middle East as well. So for more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the U.S. Involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2 years as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. He has written 5 books that you should all take a look at if you really want to start to understand the intricacies of the world as it is in the Middle East, but also some of the things that led up to that. And so Ambassador Ross, I don't want to talk anymore. I really want to get to you. Our people really want to hear from you. And so our people are seeing a lot online that is very distressing. They are seeing portraits in the media of Israel that make it pretty clear that Israel is using excessive use of force, and that they started this fight or they didn't, and that isn't accurate. And people are very confused. So I'd like you, if you would, to just kind of lay out for us what you see as what just happened, what are the actual facts of the situation that happened, and then what you see as what that may or may not mean about what it's used for.
Okay, so I want to do 2 things. I want to answer that question by basically explaining the sequence of events that produce this, but then I want to explain more the backdrop, and also how so much of what is appearing right now is completely divorced from reality. There is a narrative that has taken hold. I can tell you, I mean, just to give you a sense, my base is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, in addition to my teaching. And the person who handles media there said that I did 70 different interviews in the course of a week. Many of the questions I was getting were shaped around only Israel. I would have to bring up Hamas. We had 3 draft Security Council resolutions that President Biden blocked because they didn't even mention Hamas. I want you to think about that. The UN Security Council is supposed to be the international institution whose sole role is to promote, protect, and preserve international norms. There is no more basic international norm than you don't shoot rockets into your neighbor. But somehow Hamas didn't find its way in to these resolutions. They were completely unbalanced. And many of the questions I was getting, as I said, somehow implied this was all Israel's doing. So let's take a look, at what happened, and then I want to talk a little bit more about who Hamas is, because it's as if somehow there's this view, Hamas is being treated as if they're Black Lives Matter. Hamas doesn't believe in human rights, doesn't believe in civil rights, and God help you if you're gay in Gaza. So, all right, so we had a perfect storm. We had a perfect storm because we had a series of, we had a confluence of events that took place. First, you had Abu Mazen canceling, President Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, canceling the elections. This was a big deal because 93% of the Palestinians who were eligible registered to vote, meaning they wanted this. This was the first election since 2006. They wanted the election, and Hamas saw an opening was created because of the deep alienation that already existed, but also the reaction to the canceling of the election. This was also taking place.
Ross, can you just say a little bit more about what elections? I think a lot of our people may not know what those elections were.
Okay, so I'll give you the full backdrop. When the Palestinian Authority was created as part of the interim agreement in 1995, which I helped to negotiate, a legislative council was established, and so there was an election for a legislative council in 1996. By the way, Hamas boycotted those elections because it rejected the interim agreement, it rejected the Oslo process, and there were criteria for candidates that were, for anyone who could be a candidate, built into the interim agreement, at least into the annex, on who could participate, who could be a candidate. So they boycotted those elections. Now, after Arafat died, there was not an election for the Rais, the chairman. After Arafat died, there was a presidential election in 2005 that Mahmoud Abbas won by getting 62% of the vote. Actually, when you compare it to Bashar al-Assad, who was reelected yesterday with 95% of the vote, that's the more typical elections in the Middle East. 62% actually suggests there was something genuine about that election, but that was for the presidency. He never held another. He was supposed to have a 5-year term. He's now in the 16th year of a 5-year term. He decided, I think partly because of what I call the Biden effect, the new administration coming in, he was going to show how he was a Democrat after all. So he called for elections for the Legislative Council in May and for the presidency in July. The problem was one of the things that Abu Mazen specializes in is climbing trees, but never remembering to bring a ladder with him, because he trapped himself on this. Once again, just like in the first elections that were held back in 2006 for the Legislative Council, Fatah split into multiple different lists. Hamas has disciplined, ran one list. And the same thing was recreated again. Actually, two things were created. One, there were 3 different lists. One had to do with Marwan Barghouti, who's in jail but is more of a figure. Second one is Mohammed Dakhlan, who was sort of exiled by Abu Mazen, but he's based in the Emirates now, and he has connections in Gaza and the West Bank. And then there was a third set of candidates, and they were going to run against him. And they were much more likely to win than he was. So the combination of the split in Fatah, which would have guaranteed Hamas winning, and the likelihood that he would lose the presidential election led him to cancel the elections and blame it on the Israelis, because he said the Israelis won't let us vote in East Jerusalem. It was just a pretext, and it was seen by everybody as a pretext. So A, he cancels the elections, and that's the backdrop to the elections. B, this takes place during Ramadan. Ramadan is a period of not just increased religious contemplation and reflection, but also increased identity, national identity as well. Then you have Sheikh Jarrah. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is taking place during Ramadan. And what Sheikh Jarrah represents is several Palestinian families who moved into East Jerusalem were moved into East Jerusalem as refugees by the Jordanians after the 1948 war, when the Arab Legion took over East Jerusalem and the Jews in East Jerusalem left. These were houses that were there. They were moved into these houses. So they don't hold the title to these houses. Later on, a Jewish trust had the title, and then an active settler movement bought the title from them, and they wanted to move in and move these people out. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is an Arab neighborhood very close. It's an inner neighborhood close to the old city, but outside the walls. So here was taking place in Ramadan. This became a cause célèbre. First, because when it comes to Jerusalem, there are 2 things that set in motion a train of events that are very hard to control. One is anything that has to do with Palestinian presence and moving it out, evicting it. 2 is anything that looks like it's transgressing the holy sites. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. And what we had was a combination of a legal process that was going to lead to the eviction of these families that have lived there since 1948, that was also seized upon not only by Palestinians, but also by the Israeli right, including Ben Gvir, this former Kahana is. I can tell you a lot more about Ben-Gvir if you want, but this is one of the people that Prime Minister Netanyahu helped to ensure their votes wouldn't be lost to the right. And he goes and he sets up his office outside of in Sheikh Jarrah, outside of where these buildings are. So he obviously he wants to make it a cause célèbre. And then you have Jerusalem Day, which commemorates the victory in 1967 and the reunification of Jerusalem. So thousands of Israelis go, they parade, but they also go to the Kotel. And this is taking place during in the last days of Ramadan, which is actually the most fervent, from a religious standpoint, time of Ramadan. And on the platform, you have a plateau, and then you have the Kotel on the other side. There were rocks being thrown over the side. Now, this is serious, because first there are thousands of Israelis there. Stones are being thrown over the side. You get hit in the head by a stone, from 300 feet above you, it's going to kill you, or it certainly can. So the Israeli police had to stop that. But what they did, which made no sense, was they went into the Oscar Mosque. I can tell you, having spent plenty of time up there, what I described is throwing rocks near the edge, throwing it over the side. That's very dangerous, and it had to stop. But the Oscar Mosque, is more than 500 feet away from there. George Washington couldn't have thrown stones from the Al-Aqsa Mosque into the Kotel. You wanted to stop the people throwing rocks? Stop the people throwing rocks. Going into the Kotel made absolutely no sense whatsoever. Everybody who's there is a reporter because they all have a phone. They all videoed it. This immediately went viral, and it was portrayed, it looked like, an assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This just set everything on fire. Now, what it did for Hamas is it gave them an additional pretext. Mohammed Deif, who was he was leader of the Izzadim al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas. One of the Israelis have tried to kill him multiple times because he's responsible for more bombings than anybody else in Israel. He's never seen. He came out and said, unless the Israelis stop what they're doing in Jerusalem, we will make them pay a price. And they launched 7 rockets at Jerusalem. Now, let me put this in some perspective for you. There's 368,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. So if you're firing rockets at Jerusalem, if you're going to hit, the chances of killing a Palestinian there are not small. But that didn't matter to Hamas. Hamas also knew that once they fired rockets at Jerusalem, Israel was going to respond in a very tough fashion. They didn't care about that either. They knew Gazans would pay the price for it. They didn't care about that either. Why? Because they saw this as an opportunity to present themselves as the protector of Jerusalem, to seize the mantle of who was imposing a price on the Palestinians as a way of showing their contrast with Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority, and to catapult themselves into a position where they can try to take over the Palestinian national movement, which is their long-term aim. So they did this knowing full well what the consequences would be. Now, I want to put this in some perspective. They fired 4,350 rockets, projectiles into Israel in 10 days. Okay, so this was averaging over 400 a day. In 2014, they fired 4,500 in 51 days. In 2014, they began that conflict with 10,000 rockets. They fired 4,500. Israel destroyed 2,200. They had 3,300 left, 3,300 left after 2014. In 2021, at the beginning of this, they had 30,000 rockets. They built up dramatically during that time. But they didn't just build up their rockets dramatically. By the way, the rockets that they have now have greater range, much greater payload, meaning much greater explosive power. In addition to the rockets and building rocket assembly a rocket assembly plant and different fabrication areas. They built this massive tunnel complex. Now, I want to put this in perspective. Gaza, even before this conflict and after 2014, was largely destitute, 50% unemployment, 80% of the Gazans live on assistance from the UN, 80%. They were in desperate need of investment and of construction. And what does Hamas do? Israel in this conflict destroyed 60 miles of underground tunnel. Now today, Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza, claimed that they only destroyed 10% of all the tunnels. It's probably hyperbole. I don't think they have 600 miles of tunnels. But let's say, even the Israelis would say, they probably destroyed less than half. Now, I want you to think about that. To build all these tunnels requires a huge amount of cement. It requires an enormous amount of electrical wiring. It requires an awful lot of steel. And it requires a lot of wood because they create wood planks to fortify the tunnels. I've been in. The Israelis in 2014 destroyed 32 tunnels, 14 of which penetrated Israel. So they preserved a couple. And so I've been in them. I know exactly what went into these. Now think about it. Here's a place that's in desperate need of construction. It's in desperate need of investment. It's in desperate need of employment. And what does Hamas do? It uses its fighters to build these tunnels. It absorbs all this material, proving they don't care one whit about the well-being of Palestinians. They care about being in a position to fight Israel. And the critical point here to bear in mind is if, in fact, there is a major reconstruction effort, it is a given, unless there is a transparent means that oversees what's coming in, that can track everything that goes to the warehouses, that can track everything that goes from the warehouses to the construction site. They will again divert all these materials. They will do exactly what they've done before. So, I want to lay out 3 tracks for you of what I think can be done from here. But before I do that, I want to do one other thing. I want to explain again who Hamas is, but also a little bit about Gaza. This notion that somehow Israel is responsible ignores the reality that Israel withdrew from Gaza 100%. They dismantled all the settlements and they withdrew all the soldiers in September of 2005. Now you'll hear when you talk about, you'll hear the counterargument, but Israel really still controls everything because they put a quarantine on. They did not put that quarantine on until 2007. They withdrew in 2005, 100%. I went into Gaza and I gave a speech to a couple hundred Palestinians, unbeknownst to me at the time. The whole leader, I saw them when I got there, the whole leadership of Hamas, basically the top 10 leaders of Hamas were there. And as I turned to my host, when I recognized Mahmoud Zahar, one of the founders of Hamas, and before I could say anything, he realized I recognized him. He said, "We thought it was a good idea for the opposition to hear you." Now, this was after Sharon had announced Israel was going to get out, but before Israel had gotten out. And I said, Palestinians historically have never controlled their own destiny and been able to make their own decisions about what their future would hold. In 1948, the Arabs said, "We'll take care of it." Arafat told me when we were at Camp David that he wanted to go to the original Camp David, but the Soviets and the Syrians wouldn't let him. I actually made the case to him when we were at Camp David, you told me in the past you didn't have the ability to make decisions for Palestine's future. Now you do. And he didn't. And I said, here, Israel's getting out. Now, when they get out, you have this opportunity. You can shape what happens here. You turn Gaza into a going concern. You show that Gaza can be developed and can flourish. And it won't just be the international community that says, gee, if that works in Gaza, why not the West Bank? It'll be the Israeli public. But if you turn Gaza into a platform for attacks against Israel, then who's going to say, gee, let's take that model and apply it to the West Bank? What did Hamas do after Israel withdrew? During the process of withdrawal, they carry out an act of terror. Why? Because they wanted to make it appear that they drove the Israelis out. Now, in the first 6 months after Israel got out, there were 6 crossing points that Israel created. The crossing points carried everything into Gaza. Gaza didn't have a port, so Egypt basically kept its border closed with Gaza. So the only open border that Gaza had was Israel. There were 6 crossing points to handle all the material coming in, sort of imports and exports, to handle Palestinians who worked in Israel, to handle those who needed to go to Israel for medical treatment. 6 crossing points. As soon as Israel withdrew, over the first 6 months, Hamas carried out attacks against the crossing points. The crossing points weren't a favor that Israel was doing. It wasn't a favor to Israel to have the crossing points. This was something that was necessary for the lifeblood of Gaza. But this is what Hamas did. So Israel gets out of Gaza. For those who say they want Israel to withdraw, they've withdrawn unilaterally twice, from Lebanon and from Gaza. Now, normally the concept of withdrawal is supposed to be land for peace, or at least land for security. What did Israel get? It got land for tunnels and rockets. So the idea of who's at fault here, without, as I said, I think the Israeli moves in Jerusalem, I wrote this article in the LA Times where it said Israel was probably technically right, but it's not enough to be right. You have to be wise. They were not wise in Jerusalem. Their overall settlement policy is not wise. But that doesn't justify when Israel takes steps like it did and it withdraws, that it gets land for rockets. The reason the peace camp has been killed in Israel was partly the Second Intifada, which followed the most forthcoming government in Israel's history being prepared to accept the Clinton parameters. And the Palestinians not only said no, but they launched a violent intifada with bombs in Israel that killed 1,100 Israelis. Palestinians paid a price 4 times that much, but that plus the unilateral withdrawals killed the Israeli peace camp. And so what Hamas now wants to do is ensure that there's no possibility the peace camp can come back. This is the context in which we need to be thinking about how we talk about this issue and also how we educate those who somehow want to think that somehow Hamas is a victim here. Hamas is a victimizer. It's not a victim.
And that leads to kind of the next question I think so many of us and our congregants are holding, which is this using what's happened as an excuse, the amazing amount of anti-Semitic rhetoric that our young people and but especially our young people are confronting, and how to respond to that, how to answer when in the media, there isn't so much of what you just explained portrayed at all. It's that Israel's the perpetrator of, an overuse of force, and then anti-Semitism, that's wanting or needing to be expressed, gets conflated with anti-Zionist, anti-Israel policy.
Well, I think, look, one way to deal with this, and first of all, is to call it out for what it is. When Israel is held to a standard that nobody else is held to, then it's pretty clear that this is driven by anti-Semitism. It's true. Not everybody who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite. Not all criticism of Israel is unjustified. But what is true is when the only one you hold to a certain standard is Israel, then there's another reason you're doing it. The anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism basically says the Jews as a people do not have a right to self-determination. That's what it says. It says that the Jews as a people having a state is illegitimate. That's what it says. And that means that if you support Israel, you're illegitimate. That's anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Zionism. That's anti-Semitism. You can raise questions about Israel. You can criticize Israel. But the idea that Jews don't have a right to a state, which they built, is clearly driven by a different motivation. But it's also driven, in a sense, by a complete lack of awareness. You know, I hear some of these people who will come out and say, there should just be one state with everybody with equal rights. Really? In the Middle East, wherever there is a state that has more than one national identity, sectarian identity, or tribal identity, you have a state that is at war with itself. If you want to have an enduring conflict, then have one state. You have two national movements with two national identities. You know, in the Middle East, that's the prescription for ongoing conflict or paralysis. Two states for two peoples reflects the reality of two national identities and two national movements. So I think the way to address this in part is to fall back on the fact that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination. That's what Israel represents. That's what Zionism is. Now, look, part of the challenge has been that you've had a right-wing government in Israel that has adopted a policy that in first in principle is against two states, which means there can only be one state. It'll be a binational state. The problem is the Israeli right favors one state, and the left favors one state, but they mean something completely different by it. Although the implications would be, it's Ahmed Tibi once said, look, I favor, this is an Israeli Arab politician. He said, I favor two states, but if in the end they don't want it, and we have just one state, that's fine. We'll have one state. But of course, there'll be no right of return. I mean, Jews won't have an automatic right to immigrate here, to make Aliyah. We'll have a different anthem. I mean, basically, the definition of one state is very different depending upon who offers it. And here again, that's why I say part of our problem is also, the polarization here and the partisanship on this issue. Israel was always a non-partisan issue. Israel wasn't a Republican interest or a Democratic interest. It was an American interest. I think one of the mistakes that the Israeli government made, that the prime minister made, was embracing Trump too closely, because that created, certainly in the Jewish community, but definitely in the Democratic Party, that created a kind of syllogism, that Trump is bad, Trump's like Israel, therefore Israel's bad. So we're contending with that as well. But I think, the answer to your question is just to say, look, if the only one you apply these standards to is Israel, then you obviously have a different motivation. And just not to put too fine a point on it, we have 600,000 dead in Syria. We have 11 million people displaced in Syria. The Syrians, by the way, the Ain Hilwal is a Palestinian refugee camp on the outskirts of Damascus. I mean, it is on the outskirts of Damascus. A lot of Palestinians were killed there as part of the war. I don't understand why, other victims don't count.
I so appreciate that answer, and I just want to kind of take one piece. That there's so much information there and so much of an ability to explain it straightforward. But one of the things that I think a lot of people here are concerned with and wrestling with is how specifically are we supposed to talk about that with our kids? Or give our kids the right information, or at least the right things to say to take down the tension in the room when something comes up or when they read certain things on social media. So much of this is a new level of tension that they just haven't experienced. So as a father and a grandfather, what would you say to your family about that? Like, how would you talk to them about the way they interact with the world and with social media in this circumstance?
Look, it's obviously very hard when there's so many untruths that are spread on social media. You know, when there is this, what is rampant on social media right now is that there was a state of Palestine and Israel conquered it. I mean, it's when you're dealing with, when you deal with no truth, is what we discovered the last 4 years in our country, where there was an effort to basically say there are no facts, that there's an alternative reality. Now, that's not the province, as it turns out, only of the right. It's also the province of the left. So I think, one of the things I think when I talk, when my kids are older, but I do have grandkids, but they're really young, so it's too soon to have this conversation with them yet. But if I were having that conversation, my conversation would be one in which I say, look, the way you fight the unreality is by constantly repeating the facts and just saying, look, this is what actually happened. That's why I say, I think it's very important to remind people Israel withdrew from Gaza. You want them to withdraw, they shouldn't get rockets after they withdraw. I think that's pretty simple and straightforward. I think the message right now should be focused on Hamas basically launched rockets. Hamas basically built up dramatically. Hamas diverts all the material that comes in. Unless it can really be policed, they'll do it all over again. If you want reconstruction in Gaza, no one is going to invest heavily in it, knowing that Hamas at a time of its choosing will do the same thing all over again, not just rebuild, but they'll launch rockets when it suits their political purpose. They don't care what the price for Palestinians is. So that's pretty straightforward. But I'd also make this point. Israel has withdrawn twice, unilaterally. When it withdrew from Sinai, that's different because it was part of a peace treaty. They withdrew unilaterally twice. And what they got each time was rockets and tunnels. This is about rejection of Israel being there. Who knows? So I guess I'll make one other point. I hear this all the time. Look at the difference in numbers of deaths between the number of Israelis and the number of Palestinians. And it's not just Iron Dome. It's that Israel actually believes in protecting its people. So there's civil defense system. Every building has a bomb shelter. Every apartment building on each floor has a safe room. Israelis know when they hear the siren to go do it. I have 3 little grandsons there. They live in Ramat Aviv. And this experience, what do they have to do during the night? Because the sirens went off in Tel Aviv at midnight and 1 a.m. So, I have pictures of them out in the hallway where there's no windows. And the 5-year-old asks, why do they want to kill us?
And what do you say to the 5-year-old?
I don't find it easy to talk to him. It breaks my heart.
For many of our congregants who care deeply about the Middle East, but may not have family, deep friendships of people who live there, a big piece of what made this moment different, because for those of us who have family and friends there, these moments have been scary. It was scary in 2015. It was, the major uptick of anti-Semitism around the world with that has also really drawn in a different level of fear for people here as well. And
the reality of attacks here, even in West LA. I mean, it's.
I know. Look, I think, one of the, you certainly don't legitimize a cause by basing it on hatred and anti-Semitism. So these pro-Palestinian demonstrators are not exactly lending credence to the cause. And, I think that also has to be part of the answer. Is this what being pro-Palestinian is about? That you hate Jews? Is this what being pro-Palestinian is about? That you reject humanistic values? What I do say to kids about what's going on is that there are those whose purpose is not peace, not coexistence, not mutual tolerance, and they must be defeated. They can't define the future. We have to define the future.
And yet so many people seem to be buying into this, idea and the anti-Semitism and I understand what you're saying. That it's like rational to say, is this what defines your movement? And yet so many of our young people are seeing that their friends buy it hook, line, and sinker and don't call themselves anti-Semites. They say what the Jews are doing, is horrific. And and then the other part of that, that what the Jews are doing, not Israelis, not a certain Israeli policy, not anything, what the Jews are doing, right? And they buy that. And the other part of that is that we really are struggling to articulate how we can be in our own so comfortable in certain parts of our political identities as Americans within a movement that is also buying into a lot of that. So what do we do? So our young people are watching their peers buy into it, and some of us, who lean to the left, are also really struggling with what does it mean to have been comfortable in a certain part of the politics of America and that cause and those values, and then see, that all of. But when it comes to this, it is completely uncomfortable for us, obviously.
Well, look, I mean, we don't have a magic solution here. This is going to be a struggle because, there's no question that in the progressive side of the Democratic Party, there is a narrative that has taken hold that Israel is a victimizer and the Palestinians are the victim. And they seem to be very little concerned about any other victims anywhere else. They've created this intersectionality. They're treating Palestinians as if we're in a world of the oppressors and the oppressed, and they are portraying Israel as the oppressor. And the answer to this, I think, is in part just to continue just to repeat what the realities are. Don't grow tired of saying that. As I said, remind people Israel withdrew from Lebanon, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and they didn't get peace or security. They got rockets and tunnels. So, there was a peace camp in Israel, but basically groups like Hezbollah and Hamas killed it. Israel built a security barrier. Why? Because of suicide bombs in Israel. Israel was prepared to accept peace proposals, but they were the only ones who were prepared to accept peace proposals. Does Israel make mistakes? Yes. I think the key is, we can't say this is a morality play where one side is all right and the other is all wrong. That's not true. But we can say groups like Hezbollah are all wrong because they don't even offer anything to their own people. They expose their own people. They impose a price on their own people. I've written something where in it I said that Hamas excels at getting Palestinians killed, but they don't excel at advancing the Palestinian cause. So, I mean, there has to be a readiness to sort of fight back on the substance. We can't concede the point. And we have to challenge them on their facts.
I have so many questions that I want to ask, and you have such a way of explaining these different aspects of the situation that is really quite helpful. So I'm going to ask kind of two different parts of the question, and you choose which one you want to go with. I totally understand. I want to make sure we have a chance to kind of hear different points. The one is that the Secretary of State went and met with both Abbas and Netanyahu, signaled that there would be a new policy, a new way that America will be dealing with the Middle East and the situation, and signaled also to this notion of potentially returning to the Iran deal. And so I'm curious, this is a good idea? What will the consequences be of that situation? Where it stands? And the second half of the question, and we can table it if not, is you spoke now to this notion of no perfect side. No one's without mistake here. And the one piece we didn't hear so much about in your opening was what was going on the Israeli government formation side. And there's some curiosity here if part of the provocation that was taking place was within the Israeli government trying to stop the formation and mandate of a government. So
all right, there's a lot there. So let me approach it in pieces. Okay. So let me take the last part first. I don't believe that, obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu benefited from the conflict in the sense that right before the conflict began, it looked as if we were within 2 days of a new government, an alternative government being formed. And obviously the conflict put it on hold. Then Bennett said that there was not a change coalition that he could be a part of. It's not entirely clear that is absolutely finished. I mean, Lapid has until next Tuesday. His mandate lasts until then. And he's putting together agreements with a variety of parties, and he's trying to create a reality where he can go to Bennett and basically say, okay, we can avoid a fifth election if you now join. Will that work? I don't know. But it is true that Bibi prefers a fifth election now. He can't put together a government. Hang on for a second. I was doing that with just my battery, and it was about to run out. So I think that he clearly understood the political benefits, but I don't think it's what drove this. Once they fired rockets on Jerusalem, I don't care who was prime minister, you had to respond. Because if you don't respond, then you have Hamas in position feeling, we can do much more of this. So a price had to be imposed, and anybody, left to right, who headed the government would have responded, and they would have responded in a tough fashion. The question of how the police behaved, who was giving instructions for this, that might be something different. But here again, I don't think that came from the prime minister per se. It might have come from the interior minister, and it might have been in the context of trying to put together a right-wing government that, that the instructions were be tough here. This is Jerusalem. But again, you can't, Hamas took advantage of what they saw as an opportunity, which had been created in part by Abu Mazen's cancellation of the election. So that's that side of the questions you were raising. I think on the way forward, I was telling you before we came on that I have ideas about what can be done. There are really 3 different tracks. Track number 1 is offering the U.S. needs to mobilize the international community to create a very credible, large-scale massive reconstruction for Gaza that is conditioned on no rearmament of Hamas that is also verifiable. It means there has to be a way to, I said it before, there has to be a way to create crossing points. I'd like to see Egypt. Egypt in Rafah, Egypt has a crossing point where they allow only people but not goods. They should have a crossing point as well. There should be inspection of everything. Then there should be GPS tracking devices on the trucks that takes the materials to warehouses and from the same 24/7 cameras in the warehouses to be able to monitor that. There should be people on the ground there. They can be Egyptians. They can be some other internationals. We can also set up, monitoring stations with consuls looking at the cameras outside of Gaza. But that you have to frame this issue. It's not just the practicality of preventing Hamas. It also gets back to what I'm saying to you is there has to be a constant public framing of the issue. Hamas has a choice of allowing Gaza to develop or of having its rockets, but it can't have both. And Hamas's own instincts will be choose the rockets over its public. The more this is the way the issue is framed, the more Hamas is put on the defensive. And it reminds everybody of who the real problem is. So anyway, track number one is reconstruction, but in a way that Hamas can't benefit from it. And that means in practical terms, a mechanism for controlling what comes in and overseeing end use. Track one. Track two. There needs to be, the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank needs to be bolstered. They're secular. They're not Islamist the way Hamas is. And they, at least in principle, accept the idea of two states in a way that Hamas does not. Now, for them to be bolstered, however, you also have to take account of the reality that in the case of Palestinian Authority, the level of corruption there is what has produced great alienation among the people of the West Bank. The irony is if you had free and fair elections in the West Bank and Gaza, in the West Bank, Hamas would probably win. In Gaza, Fatah would win. The public rejects the authority because of how they operate. So track two is bolstering the PA, but in a sense, as part of the international effort to mobilize resources for reconstruction in Gaza, there should be resources mobilized for investment in the West Bank. But that, just like Gaza, should be conditioned on oversight. In the case of the West Bank, it should be conditioned on reforms, on rooting out corruption, on developing institutions, on having a rule of law. The PA can become successful if it does that. And that should be that we should not be providing assistance that is not conditioned at least on that. And the third track means that you have to do something to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. And that's what we have. We have a stalemate because of complete disbelief on the two sides. The Biden administration is absolutely right. You can't launch a big initiative to produce two states right now. First of all, the Palestinians are divided. Secondly, the politics among Palestinians makes it impossible to make any concessions. But we have the politics in Israel that make it impossible too right now. So the point is, how do you break the stalemate between the two? You take advantage of what is the one new element in the region. And that one new element is the normalization process, which obviously in the last 2 weeks, you didn't see any of the states that made peace with Israel walk away from it. They didn't call their ambassadors out. They condemned the Israelis for what they were doing in Jerusalem. Their attitudes and what they said about Gaza was in the case of the UAE, they called for, we're reducing the level of suffering to both sides. It was actually a very balanced, responsible statement. Others were just more willing to criticize the Israelis, but still, the point is nobody walked away. Now, the issue here, there was a model that was created by the UAE. The UAE is the one that took the initiative and came to the Trump administration and said, look, we'll do full normalization for no annexation and weapon systems to us that you've denied us because we weren't at peace with Israel. That can provide an interesting kind of model. We could be going to the Saudis and understand The UAE didn't suddenly just fully normalize. Their normalization process took over a decade. What happened in July of 2020, they came in and said, you know what, we're ready to go the rest of the way. But they were going to have Israelis, before COVID, Israelis were going to be allowed to have their own pavilion in the 2020 Expo in Dubai. And they were going to be allowed to travel there on their own passport. This was before the formal peace. So they were in a process of normalizing. You could have the Saudis, we could broker a move by the Saudis where the Saudis would be willing to create a commercial trade office in Tel Aviv, and they would ask for something from the Israelis for the Palestinians. It would have to be politically significant because they're making a politically significant move. The example I give is that Israel would stop building to the east of the security barrier. The security barrier is on the 8% of the territory that is closest to the Green Line, which, by the way, 85% of all Israelis who live beyond the Green Line live within that area. Only 15% live on the 92% of the West Bank, the rest of the 92%. If you're not building in that 92%, you're preserving the possibility of a two-state outcome. It doesn't guarantee it, but it preserves it as an option. So, the Saudis could point to something they were doing. It could be sold in Israel, even though the settlers will be against it. The settlers were against the normalization with the UAE. But 80% of the Israeli public supported normalization as opposed to the annexation. Now, 80% of the Israeli public don't agree on anything. But they agreed on this. Now, that means if you went ahead and you have this big step by the Saudis, not full normalization, but a big step, you could rationalize, okay, you're still going to build in what I call the blocks, but in this area, because no one has an agreed definition of the blocks, so that's why I refer to the security barrier, which, by the way, this was the original idea for the security barrier was Rabin's. Because he actually raised it with me in February of 1995, and he said, I don't know if we can negotiate a full peace agreement with the Palestinians, but I do know we have to have a partition of the land. So we're going to build this because this is the way we remain a Jewish democratic state. So Israel gets a significant move by the Saudis. The Saudis would get the ability to say, we've done something that preserves two states and, in a sense, stop the building in what would be a Palestinian state. That's the point of no longer building in the 92% of the West Bank. When you keep building there, you're building in what would be a Palestinian state. So, and it would require, the Saudis will want assurances from us for sure about the relationship with them. But that's the sort of thing that could be brokered. And it's by doing what I just described, you can break the stalemate, because also all this should be done quietly, where we work with the Saudis, we work with the Israelis, we produce what can be these parallel moves, and before we do anything, we go to the Palestinian Authority and say, okay, you don't just get to be on the receiving end. You have to take steps too. One step they could take would be to acknowledge the historic Jewish connection to the land, something they've not done. That would have a big psychological effect within Israel. Again, you want to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. And if there's anything we learned about the last 2 weeks, it's that you can't pretend the Palestinian problem will go away by itself. And you also can't pretend that if you don't deal with it, it has no implications for what happens within Israel. That we also saw.
So, Ambassador Ross, you've been so gracious with your time, and we know it's super late for you, and you're traveling to Israel. And so I would just ask, is there just something you can say to all of us who share this concern and love for Israel, wants peace for the region, are really nervous and concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, the violence on the streets of Israel, which is has not been the case like this in so long. Just anything in closing you can say to all of us who are with you, but need your eitzah, need your counsel.
Well, look, I mean, I would say the following. There is, before what happened, before this intercommunal stress, we were seeing what was for the first time serious bridge building politically between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. Now, part of it was established because of COVID, because just under 20% of all the Israeli doctors are Arab, just under 30% of all the Israeli nurses are Arab, just under 50% of all the pharmacists are Arab, and they were all on the front lines of battling COVID, and it changed the image of Israeli Arabs among most Israeli Jews, number one. Number two, polling in the last few years among Israeli Arabs made it very clear around 70% define themselves not only as Israelis, but happy to be Israelis, 70%. And what you saw with Mansour Abbas was, and what you saw from the public was a desire to be integrated into Israel. They wanted investment in infrastructure because the investment in the Arab towns and villages is dramatically less than in the rest of Israel. You know, they wanted law and order. The murder rate in the Arab areas is like close to 10 times what it is. And, you know, I would read these articles in the Israeli press by Israeli Arabs saying, if Israeli Jews were being killed this way, you know for sure the police would be dealing with this. So there, and you even have Bibi, the guy who says in 2015 they're going in droves to vote, and then who wants to put cameras to intimidate them voting in the next election. Then you have Bibi, who's the one who then reaches out to Mansour Abbas, who heads the Islamic movement in Israel. So I do believe that if there's a serious effort to reach out to all the mayors of Israel, of the Arab towns and villages, to begin a serious dialogue between the government and them about what they need, to make it clear that, you know, this is to fundamentally make it clear that they all have a stake together and are going to address it. I'm hopeful that this might have been a wake-up call. You know, look, for some it won't be, but I think there's so many Israelis I know who were just shocked by this. And they said to me, we can handle Hamas. This is a much more existential threat to us.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and travel safely, Nasiya Tova. And we should all watch this again because there's a lot to take in. And please go do whatever is going to be good for you for the rest of your nights. And thank you again for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your insight. It's incredibly valuable for us, and to share that, you know, with others is so important right now, where people don't know where to turn. They don't know where to get good information. They don't know how to begin unpacking this. So thank you for your help in that. And we wish you continued strength in sharing your wisdom and your influence. And I've read that you were criticized on both sides every time you were involved in peace negotiations or any kind of negotiations in the Middle East. It's like, which makes you a true diplomat, that you are being criticized by both sides. So I wish you continued strength in forging that path of criticism on all sides, which means you're doing the right thing.
And to our KI community, I know that there's many questions that came in. Rabbi Bernstein and I would love to continue those conversations. Send us those questions. As Rabbi Bernstein said, re-listen to this again, because a lot of information was given and we can start to unpack it all. This is not the end of our processing and engaging in our homeland and in the situation in Israel. It is just the beginning of it. And so we will continue to do so and work. And Ambassador Ross, we look forward to more opportunities to engage with you. And so everyone, thank you and good night.